here today because 1 year ago, I read an article that made my blood run cold. I remember it very distinctly. I was walking to work along High Holborn, and I pulled out my phone, and I checked The Guardian, as I do many mornings. And I was scrolling through, and an article caught my eye. And the article was saying the most extraordinary things. It was talking about this data analytics firm that had gathered massive amounts of data on the populations of the United Kingdom and the United States, had inferred people's psychological attributes from this data, and had used this data in order to target individuals who were most vulnerable and to target them with messaging that would be most likely to exploit their psychological weaknesses. And as I walked in to my office, having finished the article, my colleague, who also reads The Guardian a lot, says, "Have you read this article? This is absolutely crazy. Like, how is this even possible?" And I was asking exactly that same question. How is this even possible? But not in the same way that my colleague was. My colleague was asking, how is this even possible? Like, how do you even do this? He was a data science guy. But I was asking, how did we come this far? Because I used to work for SCL. I used to work partnership with Cambridge Analytica. In 2011, 2012, I was working on their defense division, whereas Cambridge Analytica was their elections division, but we were doing much the same thing. What I was doing is I was working with the US government to try and gather massive amounts of blog data from the Middle East, try to use social network analysis and natural language processing to predict which stories would be most likely to move people to revolt against their dictators or not. And to use that information and the dispersion of those memes in the blogosphere to predict social uprising before they happen, to potentially cause them or to intervene. Now, at this point, I was just a graduate student and eventually a young professional working on this DARPA-funded project, and I just thought it was the coolest thing in the world. I had no idea what would have become possible with that data and with that methodology years hence. And my blood ran cold because I saw in that article my fingerprints all over what had happened in 2016. If you haven't heard about it, Cambridge Analytica, which is owned by SCL, had a very big impact in influencing the outcomes of the Trump and the Brexit elections. So I was asking myself, how did this happen? How did I consider myself a good person, and my colleagues, who were some of the smartest people I've ever worked with, end up using our data science skills to ultimately become a part of something that we were so not proud of, to put extremely, extremely lightly. Now, I ended up leaving SCL because DARPA didn't end up funding our project. We were simply too expensive. Who knows whether the methodologies that I worked on for, well, what I like to call weapons of mass persuasion ever actually made it over to the other division, but I still feel this sense of responsibility. Why did this happen? And it's that question about how could this have happened that motivates my being here today. So to answer that question for myself, I had to start at the beginning. And this is the answer that this is part of the answer that I've come to. So I'm going to tell you a story. And this is a story of the development of organizations from the beginning of time, as told from the perspective of an evolutionary developmentalist. This model comes largely from Frederick Laloux's work in collaboration with Ken Wilber, but there are strands of it from Claire Graves, from Piaget, from Kohlberg, all these people who are positing stage theories of adult development. So to start, 10,000 years ago, a worldview started to emerge, and this was the idea that the world is dangerous. And it was a great idea because it was. And human beings started to band together to go beyond their initial family units and started forming the first tribes. And these tribes were the first organizations. These organizations were structured in such a way to allow people to gain maximum security through winning power. Now, organizations structured this way had a very typical setup. There's typically a very powerful leader who ruled through fear. And that people feared the leader so much that they would be less likely to fight amongst each other. The initial proto-empires were kind of the highest stage that these red or impulsive organizations got to. And indeed, organizations that are operating this way still exist today in the form of street gangs and the mafia because they're highly adaptive to environments of danger, environments where people are not safe. But these had two big breakthroughs, these tribal organizations. First, they allowed for a division of labor. We didn't have to fight amongst each other all the time. We could actually trust one another to do our work. And second, it allowed for top-down authority. People would take orders through fear, but they would still take orders. It allowed for some modicum of organization. 5,000 years ago, with the discovery and development of agriculture, a new worldview took hold. And this is the idea that the world is governed by immutable laws. And what is life about if the world is governed by immutable laws? Well, it becomes about following the rules, or in a European context, about following God's law. So this was the structure of pretty much all agrarian societies, and particularly ones in Europe up until the Enlightenment. And it's the structure of all compliance-focused organizations today. A classic example of this is an organization like the Catholic Church. And these had some big advantages over the tribal organizations that came before. First, you had replicable processes. People didn't forget things. If you planted crops one way one year, you're probably going to get the same result as last year. You could hand down these processes. And it also allowed for a stable org chart. A tribal leader could be killed by a second in command at any time, lawfully. The Pope is not so much getting challenged in the Vatican by cardinals to a death match, which is really useful. So now we're getting into something which may be more familiar. 500 years ago, we saw the dawn of the achievement or the industrial age. And with this came the worldview that the world is not so much orchestrated by God's laws, but it is a clockwork. It is a billiard ball. This is the Newtonian vision of the world, along which a lot of the thinking that informs where we are today is based. And the idea of life in the achievement of the industrial age is to figure out how the mechanism works so that we can control it and harness it for our benefit. Classic example of organizations running like this are Ford's factory in 1920, but also Ford's factory today. This is the paradigm along which most organizations today are run. They are run like machines, which is why we see this language of human resources, of leveraging capital. Human beings in machine-based organizations are seen more as cogs in the machine to be improved, but if they don't work, can easily be replaced. And how do you evaluate any machine? By the quality and the efficiency of its outputs. So a machine-based model of the human organization permits really one main mode of valuation. And I want to jump to this. I guess this isn't really part of the breakthroughs per se, but the notion of shareholder value and the purpose of an organization being to generate shareholder value, I would argue, ultimately comes from this mental model of what an organization is. You evaluate a toaster if it toasts, and if it efficiently toasts it. Nothing else really matters. And if you see an organization as a machine meant to generate value for the output, which is the shareholders, people who ultimately own it legally, then that is the kind of organization you're going to get. Now, these had huge advantages over the compliance organizations before. It allowed for meritocracy, it allowed for innovation, it allowed for accountability, because suddenly, if you were born a second son, you didn't have to go be a knight or a priest. If you produced good things for the organization, you could work your way up, you could own your results, innovation was rewarded. Now, there are some challenges with this in that the shareholder value paradigm really only respects, or at least really prioritizes one perspective, which is the shareholder's perspective. It's almost become a dogma. And I thought the talk which came just before me was a perfect setup, because I could imagine that kind of worldview, that kind of dogma of shareholder value as informing a lot of the decisions that people make within organizations of this type. Now, there is a level which incorporates what came before, which was called the Postmodern and the Information Age organization. And this comes with the idea that the world is made up of a complex set of relationships. It is a living system, more like a biological organism, rather than a machine. And what do we do with the living system? Well, we nurture it. We try to be sensitive to the perspectives of all those in the living system, and we try to nurture it like an ecologist or a gardener or a parent does, which is why the mental model of an organization like this is a family. Great example of kind of where this emerged, really became popular in the 60s, which seems like a really weird paradigm for which to start an organization from, but if you think about it, most of the world's most successful organizations today were started by hippies, or at least boomers. You can see the culture of innovation and empowerment in organizations like Apple and Google and a lot of the most successful companies today. Now, importantly, here are the three big breakthroughs of pluralist organizations. Empowerment. People are treated more like family members to be nurtured and less like cogs to be replaced. A values-driven culture, and most importantly, stakeholder value. This jump from shareholder value to stakeholder value, for me, is the fundamental thing that was driving what happened to me at SCL. Because we were good people, but we were in an organization that really only cared about shareholder value. And you know who pays really well? Third world dictators, governments in power, and really aggressive political parties. They could pay, and that was our sole focus. We really weren't that focused on stakeholder value, on the impact of our work on the world. So while there's this higher level, I don't want to talk so much about that. I want to talk about this jump as something that I think is necessary in the world today so that we don't make mistakes like the mistakes that I made several years ago. So in this jump to stakeholder value, what we're really talking about here is expanding the circle of concern. You know, it was considered a big jump a couple years ago to be customer focused. Let's think about the customer, let's think about what they want as opposed to just sort of thinking up for what targets my boss is giving me, just looking up in the silo and focusing there. But I think it's time that we go to a much broader level. So I asked myself, what might have made a difference? Now, an organizational culture is a tremendously difficult thing to transform, and that's not what I'm going to focus on in this talk because it's simply not my area of expertise. I'm a data scientist, but I'm also a product manager. And a product manager is a creative problem solver who brings together other people in the organization to get shit done. So when I think about the tool set that's available to me as a product manager as it relates to this problem of honoring stakeholder value over shareholder value, I see there are some big gaps. So when I look at my bread and butter, the business model canvas, currently considered a form of best practice, very big in the lean and the agile community. It's a great way of conceptually modeling an organization's business model and improving it. I see partners, I see customers, I see the business honored through the cost and revenue structure, but I don't see anyone else. The other big tool that I have, which is the value proposition canvas, a subset of the business model canvas, of course, we're just looking at customers and the value proposition which we give them. The other tool, which is really my bread and butter as a product manager, is called the opportunity canvas. It's a conceptual framework for trying to design different solutions to solve a customer problem. All that is here are customers and the business. None of these frameworks, these best practice frameworks, which are the starting point for me for figuring out what solution to that build, whether that solution is a simple dashboard or whether that solution is a weapon of mass persuasion, it doesn't incorporate other stakeholders. So a couple of academics and I thought about this problem. I gave a similar talk at a conference last year, and two academics, Giles Hindle and Richard Begin, approached me and said, let's see if we can work on something. And what we have been working on, and should be published in a paper next month, is a tool to help problem solvers within organizations who are thinking about what solutions to build when it comes to analytics to understand the impact of their work on other stakeholders. And I want to introduce this tool to you today. So we were inspired by Dr. Markula's work, who has a Center for Ethics out in Silicon Valley, associated with Santa Clara University, which I think is perfect. And he has a framework which I would call the greatest hits of ethical reasoning. So one domain is utilitarian reasoning. So greatest good for the greatest number. John Stuart Mill is just down the street. We should all be familiar with that. Then there's the question of rights. Does what you're doing violate anyone's rights? This is where Immanuel Kant gets his due. Then there's justice. This is where John Rawls gets his due. And this is the question about, is what we're doing fair? Does it equally honor all parties? Then there's the questions of common good, which is, does what we do elevate the common good? Is this decision likely to affect resources like the environment, which affects everyone? And then finally, virtue. Does what we are doing make us better people or does it make us worse people? I was not thinking from any of those perspectives when I was doing my work at SCL. Primarily, I was thinking about utilitarian in a very narrow sense. So we wanted to try and take some of these concepts, these questions associated with these ethical domains, and fit a canvas around it. So without further ado, this is the Business Ethic Canvas 1.0. So it starts with 2 categories of concerns that are universal to all business canvases. Actually, by the way, who here has used a business canvas of some sort? Okay, so just a brief primer on canvases. They're just sheets of paper on which you stick sticky notes. And the sticky notes represent ideas, and it's really useful because you don't get too attached to sticky notes. Or if you write things in permanent pen, you tend to get very attached to them, and it stifles creativity. These are creative tools for iterating over designs for different kinds of solutions that you might build. So I'm going to go over the design of this canvas and take you through an example so you understand how you could use it yourself in your own work. So it starts with the same thing that all business canvas starts with, which is users and solutions. This is the value proposition. What are we delivering to our users? This is where it gets different. Then we have a column which asks you to list all of the stakeholders, which are all of the people who could help or all of the people who might be affected by the work that you're doing, by the solution that you are proposing. Then there's a set of questions for each of the ethical domains. So if we look at utility, for instance, does this solution produce the most good for the most number? Ooh, that is a new animation. Or sorry, you probably didn't see that. I saw that here. Never mind. Right. Does the solution respect the rights of all of those involved? Justice. Does this solution produce its goods in a fair way? Common good. Virtue. So I want to share an example so this really becomes clear. So I work with a data science team at Trainline. We've got about 7 data scientists, and there are very few people that are doing data science work in rail. And we have the benefit of having about 20 years of transactional data and access to an incredible variety of train positioning data from going way back. So we have a lot of problems that we could potentially solve. So one idea that we had was this, and this is one of my favorite ideas. And it was to build a recommendation engine to allow ourselves to recommend journeys that you might like to take. So this is say, hey, if you're free this weekend, for £10 you can get up to Stonehenge, and here we can provide discounted tickets. We've got a special deal with the actual travel provider. We just thought this was a cool idea. And our users and customers, of course, were leisure, train, and coach travelers, because of course we now sell coach. This is where things got different. So when we thought about our stakeholders, there are actually way more stakeholders involved in this solution than we initially thought. So of course there's the team members developing the solution, which is us, but there's also corporate leadership, the C-suites. There's also our shareholders, KKR, which is our private equity owners. There's also rail and coach providers, of course. There's also leisure trip providers, people who can provide good experiences for people. But there's also leisure destination owners, employees, and there's also the communities in which leisure destinations are embedded. So all of these stakeholders represent perspectives from which these ethical concerns can be applied. So when we look at utility, well, first there's the obvious business utility, which is that, so one more thing about this canvas. Yellow stickies represent neutrals. Green represents ethical opportunities, which are opportunities to improve the ethical value of the initiative that we're talking about. And red are ethical risks. These are things that we need to mitigate or avoid. So one upside was that, hey, we could elevate customer lifetime value by boosting purchase frequency, kind of the classic business problem we get as data scientists. But of course, this would also create an opportunity cost of not building more profitable solutions. That's a risk. Now, for customers, we could actually create more adventure in people's lives, which I think is an unqualified good, but that's subjective. However, this would leave less money for consumer essentials. We have to be mindful of that. This could also raise profitability for rail and coach providers and increase ridership. One of the biggest challenges that the rail industry has is 50% of rolling stock goes unsold. Your morning commute is absolutely jam-packed, but your afternoon journeys are carting around hot air. How can we make rail more profitable so that rail providers can invest in better infrastructure and better services? Of course, this would also increase the load on rail and coach networks, which we have to be mindful of. Importantly, this would bring money to communities around attractions. If we're sending more people to Stonehenge, then we're actually distributing wealth that was usually concentrated in cities, which is the main population we were targeting, and actually distributing it to other areas, which is a great utility. However, we could also increase congestion in local communities. If we make it unworkable to go to Stonehenge, we kill the golden goose. We weren't thinking about any of this before we started, but because we make $2 billion a year in sales, and we have about 30 million customers in Europe, we can actually break things with our sheer scale. And we wouldn't have thought about this if we weren't mindful of it. Now there's the rights question. Now an important thing is we needed to respect the customer's right to privacy and security. This is GDPR, need I say more. But we also needed to protect the community's rights to regulate traffic to their public areas. If we are sending tons of people to the monument in Trafalgar Square, well, that would be weird because there aren't really direct trains there, and we make that area, and we actually violate the community's rights, whoever is maintaining that monument, that is an issue which we need to be mindful of. Then there's the justice question, and this is why I love this initiative so much, and I referenced it earlier, but I think this could help reduce inequality by spreading wealth to less well-off communities. The reality of the information age is that it promotes clustering. A lot of value is created in increasingly centralized spaces like here in London, and land simply doesn't have the same value as it used to. If we can make land outside of cities more valuable by having people go there more, we could actually make this society more fair. Then there's common good. I hope that we could raise interregional empathy by increasing trust and security. I hope that we could replace day trips via car with rail and how it therefore reduce the carbon footprints. But of course, if we're getting more people to travel by rail or travel in general with day trips, because we also sell coach journeys, then if someone is at home binging on Netflix, they've got a much lower carbon footprint than someone who is traveling all over the UK every weekend. We had to be mindful of that. Then from a virtue perspective, I really hope that this would help build compassion for our team through greater interregional awareness. We would need to travel in order to actually understand our customers. So this took about 40 minutes sitting with my team, and they were just calling things out. I was writing it down and sticking it up on this canvas. By the end of this, we had a completely different vision of what the real impact of our work could be. And we had some real actions. We knew to reach out to attraction providers to understand what kind of load they could take. We had new KPIs to monitor, not just business KPIs, but also social KPIs. We could create quantitative measures out of this. So what I really like about this tool, there's really two things. One is that it's easily integrated into best practice product development. The way that we typically work in product, the way that I typically work in product, is we start with a canvas which describes the value proposition, we iterate on solutions, and then eventually we ship something that actually works. Never do we take into account the stakeholders. We're now doing business ethics canvases with our opportunity canvases for every major initiative that we start off. It's a very low investment of time, but it produces a much more satisfying outcome for everyone. Particularly, this is more of an article of faith, but if you're ethical, you tend to do better from a shareholder value perspective in the long term, but that's sometimes difficult to see. The other thing which I really like about this canvas is that it's a creative problem-solving tool, not a quantitative evaluation tool. I love the previous talk for its ability to quantify the seemingly unquantifiable aspects of culture, and that is amazing for course correcting. The challenge that we have in our day-to-day work, however, as people who are actually working on concrete solutions for customers and solving problems for our business, is not the question of is our business ethical, but it's the question of how can I make my work more ethical. So the intention of this canvas is not so much to rate or to, it's not to rate, it's not to judge. It is to provide stimuli to help us as practitioners think in a more ethical way about the work that we do, to explore the ethical space and to make our work better from all of the relevant ethical standards. I have no idea where this is going to go. I've only used it within Trainline a couple of times. There are other people doing this work. but no one's actually used this particular tool. So I would be very, very grateful for any data science practitioners, people who are building models and trying to solve business problems with data science on a daily basis, whether this is useful for you. And that is my offering to this audience. And thank you very, very much for listening.